Welcome to the Keto Geek Podcast. Let's do this.
Health, nutrition, fitness, low-carb lifestyle.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Keto Geek Podcast. Today I am joined by Corey. Anyway, Corey, before you can say a single word, I have a very, very huge announcement for everybody. Can you guess what I'm going to say?
Starts with a P?
Sorta, kinda. More like an AP. Guys and gals, stop this podcast. We are on Amazon Prime. That was a lot of breaks in there, wasn't it? So, yes, our energy pods are on Amazon Prime. The chocolate, by the time this podcast comes out, most likely that will be there. If not, look for it in a couple of days. Follow us on our social media and check out our in news, everything that we blast out. We're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, we're every place you can think of. So yes, we're excited. All our products, not all our products, but our chocolate and our pecan energy pod will be available for 2-day shipping through Amazon Prime. And as we speak, the price is 15% down. And if you do purchase those, please leave us an awesome review. That would mean a lot. So yes, Corey, how are you today?
Doing pretty good. How are you?
Summer is in full fire mode, but at the same time, California is not that hot at the moment.
No, it's nice and breezy, actually, with the little warm sun. My favorite.
Yes. Speaking of warm, breezy stuff, you know, today's podcast is really strong. It is huge.
I'm super stoked.
So, yes, have you ever wondered why you like coffee and I don't, and you have a stronger preference for steak, but I prefer something a little bit more spicy and salty and these extreme palates. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, have you also wondered that certain things are more addictive to certain people rather than, you know, everybody?
Yeah, it has made me wonder, what is the mechanic behind all that?
Oh, and you know what's also really fascinating? Think of how a lot of people in the low carb or keto or diet or health or nutrition field say, okay, sugar is the most addictive, worst thing on earth. And some people say fat is the most worst thing on earth. And some say a combination of fat and sugar is the worst thing on earth. But if you take the most purest form of sugars or carbs, which is practically, let's take table sugar, and then you mix that with the purest form of fat, which is MCT oil, ghee, olive oil, combine them two together, and it is by far the most disgusting thing you can ever consume.
Yeah. That's
we tried
really
it.
hard.
Yeah. So there's something going beyond these narratives of straight up macros that people blast out everywhere. And this podcast talks about just that. The brain is complicated and the body is complicated. And Stephan J, his book, The Hungry Brain, he's onto something, guys and gals. Buy it. It's on Amazon. It's worth its money. If you're looking for the next keto book, go buy this one. It's not even keto, but you go buy it. And it talks about some of the really important concepts that we stress on all the time. And by the way, speaking of summer, our energy pods, people say they kind of start melting. And I wanted to address this concern, and feel free to add anything else to it. So our energy pods contain natural fats from plant sources and animal sources. They don't contain hydrogenated fats. So what exactly are hydrogenated fats? They're the stuff that give, for example, peanut butter their structure. Like if you put a peanut butter jar upside down, you'll notice that it is practically immortal or immobile inside the jar. And it when it melts, it's always in the same consistency. Mm-hmm. So that doesn't happen with our product. So you have to mix it up a little bit. But we wanted to avoid the hydrogenated fats, and that was a podcast we also covered, and I think it was Tucker Goodrich who talks about the deleterious effect of hydrogenated and omega-6 fats and all of that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Check that out, by the way, if you are interested in it. Another thing about a lot of peanut butters in store is that they have sugars in them, and their texture is literally just geared to be obesogenic, because there's a concept that we sort of are thinking about quite often. It's called vanishing caloric density. So what exactly is vanishing caloric density? Now, there's no science that I'm aware of, and so you can just throw this out of the window. But if you notice how fruits can be consumed in a much larger quantity when you blend it into a smoothie rather than, eating it as is, that is our term for vanishing caloric density. You can consume a lot more food by just varying the texture. Mm-hmm. So that is something to be aware of. So if you get the pod melted, just mix it up, put it in the fridge if you like it chilled, or just eat it as is. It's just that simple. But speaking of pods, Corey, I think we've made some tweaks, haven't we?
Oh, yeah. I'm really excited to announce these things. So we changed, played around with some ingredients in two of our pods. Let's start with chocolate. So we decided to find a chocolate that was a little bit more geared towards the fudgy and decadent side spectrum of dark chocolate. And we found something that is perfect. It has a higher fat content, actually. So you're going to have a lot more of a rich chocolatey flavor to the chocolate fudge energy pod. If you already love the chocolate energy fudge pod, you're going to love this thing even more. And those are shipping out on Amazon Prime.
Oh, yeah. Amazon Prime.
Very excited, yes.
Yeah, it's a huge achievement for us. And please, let's go to number 1 on the pudding section, the sports and nutrition pudding section. There's practically like 40 products on there. We want to be number 1.
We will be number 1.
We made it to number 2.
Yes.
We will go to number 1. We're coming for you, number 1, whoever it is. It's like the niche of niche category.
Yeah. And
dude, we competed with those products despite the fact that we were not even Prime and we were a number 2.
Oh, I know. And we're getting better ratings on everything on that category. So I'm stoked to be number 1 sports pudding on Amazon. Sweet.
No puns intended.
To segue into the next flavor tweak that we made, we decided to spruce up the spiced walnut energy pod. I received some feedback from folks that was mixed, and I decided to listen to one of the crowds. In my palate too, I was finding that the walnut energy pod good, but the flavors weren't binding as well as I imagined them to bind. So I added a little bit of ginger and a little bit of sea salt, and that actually brought everything together. So now the spiced walnut energy pod is a total heavy hitter, and I can't wait till we bring that thing to Amazon Prime as well.
Oh yeah. And there's another modification we made, and I am holding this in my hand if anybody's looking at it in the video. You should explain it to them what it is.
So we decided to revamp the Keto Geek ghee label and give it that Napa premium wine bottle feel. So I took inspiration from a wine bottle that sat in our office for quite a bit until I made Vahad drink it. I took the inspiration, just simplified the label, made it really streamlined and clean, added the good old Keto Geek gold as the trim, and just basically made it really, really clean and nice. And even the paper now has a laid texture upon it. So when you grab the jar, you feel its weight. You feel the texture upon the paper. It just feels overall nice, and it looks better than any ghee jar I've seen on the market thus far.
And like you said, it captures the flair of Napa. Mm-hmm. We're from Napa. I had to mention that,
Napa Valley.
Brag about it. We're cool.
Oh, we are. World renowned and famous.
Yeah. But there's something that needs to be addressed here, which is how taste should not be the only factor in deducing the kind of foods you're eating. Mm-hmm. Because if you pursue taste only, that could lead to a lot of overconsumption, because we're literally hardwired to chow as much food as possible. And the food companies that we have, our fellow food companies, they ain't gonna help ya. So this is why we brought in someone like Stephan, and we had a conversation with him. How do we change this? And we also discuss a lot about the insulin, what's that hypothesis? Insulin...
Carbohydrates.
Yeah, carbohydrate insulin hypothesis. And guys and gals, my perspective has changed. Has yours?
It has. It's totally flip-flopped, most definitely.
Yeah, so once you get to hear this, you'll understand what the problem is, and maybe we might need to approach things a little differently. And the problem of obesity and chronic conditions might be a little bit more multifactorial, quite a lot multifactorial, than just pointing fingers at carbs alone. So this is where we stand at this moment. But let me give people a little bit of a bio on who Stephan is. So Stephan J. Guyenet is a PhD, is a former neuroscience and obesity researcher and author of the kick-ass book, The Hungry Brain, Outsmarting the Instincts That Make Us Overeat, which was named one of the best books of 2017 by Publishers Weekly. His research has been cited more than 2,000 times by his scientific peers. His writing and speaking focuses on brain circuits that regulate eating behavior and body fatness and how we can work with them to sustainably manage our waistlines. Corey, I was really waiting many months to have this conversation because as a food company, I think it's very important that we keep direct contact with smart people and researchers who are on the front line battling obesity, and we create foods and protocols that follow effective methods.
It's absolutely pertinent that we stay in contact with these folks because they're doing really, really hard work, and they're doing the work that no one else wants to do. And they're also putting their life on the line, not life, but they're putting their reputation on the line by doing all this.
And this was the vision, true vision of Keto Geek. We take the information that these researchers are bringing up and share it with the community, create products that potentially could help in lifestyle changes, in food and dietary changes. And the goal is to create kick-ass human beings. And I think, Stephan, you agree with that as well. Don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think that should be the focus. And it starts with you as a smart consumer making smarter choices in what you eat. The problem of our current time is not lack of food. It is the perpetual abundance of really terrible food. That is the crisis we need to start facing. And you guys have the power to drive the change. Be smart about it. Move smart, eat smart. Let's change the world. And ladies and gentlemen, let me bring to you this great interview with Stephan Guyenet.
Yeah, so I have always been interested in health and nutrition from a pretty young age. Always been interested in science, and so I eventually got into neuroscience. I was particularly interested in the brain because I viewed it as one of the last remaining frontiers in science, one of the really last remaining major frontiers. To this day, there's a lot that we don't understand about the brain, and we're going to be studying it for a long time before we understand everything, if we ever do. And that's kind of amazing, isn't it? Like we can't even understand the thing that makes us able to understand things. Like we can't understand this organ that makes us who we are. No one has the ability to fully understand it. It's so complex. And so, anyway, so I kind of ended up mixing my interest in health and nutrition with my interest in neuroscience. Eventually, after I got my PhD at the University of Washington, then I did a postdoc also at the University of Washington studying obesity and the role that the brain plays in obesity. And by that time, I had a kind of ancestral perspective as well. I had been very impressed by the fact that a variety of non-industrial cultures had very low rates of chronic disease and obesity and many of these things that we are concerned about today. And so I wanted to understand what causes a species that has been mostly lean for its entire existence to suddenly not be lean anymore. And so I felt that the brain was a really good place to look for a number of reasons, but one of the primary reasons is simply that the brain is the organ that generates behaviors. So if you think that eating behavior, how much we eat or what we eat, has anything to do with body fatness, or if you think that physical activity or how we sleep or anything like that has anything to do with body fatness, then you think the brain is important. And so, so I felt that I had this kind of important concept that was not very well appreciated in, that most people weren't really fully grasping the implications of. And also the fact that body fatness is actively regulated by the brain. That's something we can come back to. So that's what I did for my postdoc. Then after that, I decided not to pursue academic research, and I've done a few things since then, including science consulting and writing this book, The Hungry Brain, which is kind of my magnum opus about why I think we eat too much food in the modern world and gain fat.
Okay. Why did we gain fat? I know this is the most general question I can ask you, but what happened? Where do you think was there a spark, or was this a step-by-step journey towards humanity moving towards this direction?
Yeah, so if you look at obesity trends in the United States, you can find evidence that we started gaining fat a long time ago. People often focus on the so-called obesity epidemic that started in the late 70s or early 80s. And that was a spike. There was an acceleration of the trend that happened at that time, but the trend has been going on for probably more than a century in the United States. And I think that it probably the fundamental cause of the trend is progress in affluence and technology. And basically what that's allowed us to do is profoundly change our food environment and our lifestyle environment in a way that favors overconsumption of food and less physical activity, really. I mean, I think it breaks down mostly to that, because, if you have no technology, let's say you're a hunter-gatherer living in a natural environment, you can only eat the foods that you find in your environment, and you can't process them very much. So you have to be eating unprocessed, whole, natural foods. However, the better your technology gets and the more affluent you become to be able to afford these technologically advanced processed foods, the easier it is for you to get foods that essentially cater to your brain's own food preferences. So foods that are more tempting, more motivating than anything that you'd be able to find in a natural environment, and also more calorie dense, lower in fiber, essentially all of the factors that we know contribute to overconsumption and obesity. And at the same time, we have mechanized physical activity out of our lives. So if you go back 150 years, life itself was physical activity. And certainly for hunter-gatherers, that's true as well. We didn't have cars. We had to get around by walking or on horses or riding bikes. Simple things like doing the dishes and washing clothes. We have machines for that now. And, many of us were farmers at that time. Many of our ancestors were farmers. So you had to weed the fields, you had to milk the cows, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of manual labor in factories as well in early industrializing societies. So basically, our lives today are radically different. And essentially, I guess if I could boil it down to the simplest, highest level picture I could, I would say that the progress of technology and affluence has allowed us to cater to our brain's hardwired preferences for certain food properties and certain levels of physical activity that those preferences evolved basically for energy conservation. And so when you can satisfy those preferences extremely effectively, your body gets really good at conserving energy and you start putting on fat. And so those high-level trends have expressed themselves in many ways, some of which include increases in sugar consumption, increases in added fat consumption, generally more food being everywhere in our environment, dramatic reductions in food costs, increases in automobile availability, increases in all kinds of appliances. So there are many ways in which these trends have been expressed. Another thing that I'm going to throw into the pot here that I think has something to do with the obesity epidemic, the recent one that started somewhere around 1980, is the reduction in cigarette smoking. So in the United States, we used to smoke a lot. Back in the 50s through the 70s, people smoked a lot of cigarettes. And the per capita consumption of cigarettes has declined by about more than 70%. It's declined by about 3/4 since then. And we know that nicotine suppresses appetite. We know that it suppresses body fatness. And so probably one of the reasons that we got fatter between the 80s and now is that we're smoking fewer cigarettes, and that's not constraining our body fatness as much. And basically, we would have been fatter in the 70s if we hadn't been smoking so much, but that kind of suppressed the level of body fatness that we would otherwise have had during the 60s and 70s. Because, let's be honest, the diet wasn't that healthy back then either.
Interesting. I never would have thought that way. So does that mean everybody can now go out and start smoking?
Yeah, absolutely. No, of course, smoking cigarettes is not worth it. It's horrible for you. But I will say that, we have e-cigarettes now that are probably far less harmful than smoking regular cigarettes. And I don't know. I'm not recommending using those for weight control, but it probably would help weight control, even though I'm not recommending it.
That's interesting. So one of the things that we notice all the time is there's a new diet that comes around every 2, 3, 4, 5 years. I'm not sure how soon that is, but there's the paleo movement, there's the keto movement. A lot of these things come in, but yet the obesity rates go up. Why is that? I mean, they show promise, but they fail. What's going on?
Yeah, I think these strategies are things that can help individuals, but they're just not up to the task of reversing the societal trends in body mass index or body fatness. So, yeah, it's, I think it's a good point, though. Like, you have government advice to eat certain types of foods. That advice gets kind of more pointed in the 1980s and is more focused on a low-fat diet. That certainly did not stop the obesity epidemic. Now, low-carbohydrate dieting is more prevalent, seems to be capturing people's attention more than low-fat, and yet obesity rates continue to increase there, too. And I think fundamentally, this just shows obesity is a really hard problem to treat on a societal level. It's a hard problem on an individual level, but it's an even harder problem on a societal level. And I think that part of the reason for that is that to fight obesity, you have to fight human nature. Mm-hmm. And that's a very difficult thing to fight. And so, the reason we carry more fat than many of us would want to be carrying, a lot of that just has to do with the fundamental kind of propensities and susceptibilities of the human brain. And, people don't eat pizza because they think it's good for them. They don't drink soda because they think it's good for them. They don't eat ice cream because they think it's good for them. They don't think those things, nobody thinks those things are slimming, but we do it anyway because we like those foods and they're cheap and they're convenient. And so I think, human nature is driving us into this situation. And I think that's a very powerful force that you have to combat. So when you have a diet like, let's just pick the low carbohydrate diet. I'm not picking on it, but just choosing it as an example. When you look at studies, it tends to promote weight loss, but a lot of people have a hard time sticking with it. They start off in these randomized controlled trials doing really well and they're losing weight. And then by the end of it, they're kind of barely on the diet after a year or two. And so I think that adherence is a major thing. People have trouble staying motivated enough to remain on any diet. And if they could, it would probably be more effective for them. And then there's this other fundamental problem that body weight is actually regulated by the brain. And so the brain, quote unquote, wants you to be at a certain weight. And when your body fat level starts dropping below that level, your brain starts to kick in compensatory responses that make it increasingly difficult to do that, to continue to lose weight. And there may actually be some workarounds that we can apply that can help us deal with this problem in a more effective and easier way. And I actually think the ketogenic diet is probably one way that you can use to help deal with that problem. And we can talk about that more if you want. But so essentially once a person develops obesity, to their brain, to these non-conscious brain circuits that regulate body fatness, that is the new normal. And if they try to lose weight, especially just by regular calorie restriction, like let's say you have someone who has obesity and they just cut their calories, they will lose weight. If they actually effectively cut their calories, they definitely will lose weight. There's no question about that. And let's say they now are only overweight. So they've lost, 30 pounds. They're now only overweight. Generally, what you see is that these body fat regulating circuits in the brain will start kicking in something that I call the starvation response, because it really is a starvation response. That is an accurate description. Basically, your hunger goes up, your cravings go up, your energy expenditure, so your calorie burn rate that your body has, goes down. Your brain essentially enters into this mode where it's trying to bring more calories in and let go of fewer calories in order to replenish those fat stores. And so a person who is overweight but previously obese is not the same as someone who started off overweight. The person who started off overweight will have a much easier time maintaining their weight than someone who is overweight but previously was obese. So the brain remembers that obese state and is trying to get back to it. And again, there are ways to mitigate that issue, but that is kind of the default behavior that you see with weight loss. So, okay, so just to give kind of a high level overview of what I just said, you have a couple of different factors. One is that people just have a hard time sticking to weight loss diets in general. You're fighting against human nature when you try to get people to apply these diets. But the second one is that the brain actually resists fat loss. And so it's actually challenging physiologically to get someone to lose large amounts of body fat.
Mm-hmm. One of the things, just to backtrack a little bit, is coming from a food company perspective. When everybody says and kind of deduces food in words like it's delicious, not like it's healthy for me, I think that might be also the problem, because within that encapsulated word, it's delicious, there's a lot, at least that's what I think, there's a lot going on within your body and how your brain processes that food. And evolutionarily somewhat speaking, you're the expert, by the way, so feel free to destroy my arguments, by the way. So, but evolutionarily speaking, it seems like we're geared to become, if we favor taste as the topmost priority, then it is going to end up in an obesogenic environment. So when we hear from people, your food is delicious, it's kind of a compliment, but at the same time, we're thinking, maybe there's other things people need to start looking into outside of just these words, because this leads the food companies to kind of destroy the diet. For example, right now, let's take paleo for an example. paleo diet came in, people noticed some great results, and then the consumer greed comes in, and the food companies are like, let's create these amazing products that are very high calorie, very addictive.
Paleo cookies.
Yeah, see, that's what I'm talking about. And then people start describing these diets as, oh, this food is so tasty and so good, you should try it. And so people start to replicate the whole sort of restaurant atmosphere into their diet as well. And that leads to some complications. So when you just said we're fighting against this huge human nature, if we're using these terms, that's going to be a very tough battle right there. So, but with smart education, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I think that, the reason, I'm sure you're well aware of this, but the reason that people use those terms is because that's a very strong motivator for people. And this gets back to how our brains are wired. Food is one of the most powerful motivators that there is for humans. It's actually really hard to compete with as a motivator. So there are a few other things that can do it, like sex or social factors are very big motivator for humans. But that's about it. Aside from sex and social factors, maybe money would probably be another one. But food is up there as one of the most powerful motivators that there is. And that's part of the reason why it's so hard to change your relationship with food. It's very powerful. But I think that, and this gets back to the problem that you're alluding to, that our conception of flavor, the, criteria that our brain applies to decide whether a food is delicious or not, tends to correspond really well with its calorie intake. Not perfectly, but really well. And so the substances that our brain uses to gauge deliciousness that, happens via communication between our digestive tract, including our mouth and our small intestine and our brain, are things like fat and carbohydrate and protein and glutamate, which is that meaty umami flavor, and also salt. So salt is the only nutrient that is motivating and reinforcing that I know of that does not contain calories. All of the other ones they contain calories. So basically, we have a calorie-seeking brain that is hardwired to seek different sources of calories, and this makes a lot of sense. If you think back in evolutionary history, humans, how do you survive in a natural environment? One of the main things you have to procure for yourself is calories. If you can't get enough calories, you're done. It doesn't matter how much vitamin A you have. It doesn't matter how much, zinc you have. If you don't have enough calories, you're done. And so the brain has been hardwired to really care about calories a lot on a very basic, intuitive level, and to motivate us and cause us to learn how to get foods that contain a lot of calories. And so basically, and that's great if you live in an environment where calories are scarce and where you have to exert a lot of energy to do your daily activities of daily living. But in our current environment, we're just surrounded by these really easy calories, and we don't have to work physically to obtain them. So it's those same drives that are built into our brains kind of push us toward those things. And I think that is something that undermines weight loss efforts. I mean, clearly it undermines weight loss efforts, but I think it undermines the ability of diets and commercial products to be effective, because basically if you're designing a product, if you don't make it delicious, it's not going to sell. But the fact that it is delicious, the fact that it is delicious actually probably reduces its effectiveness if your goal is weight loss. And so it's a really tough problem to solve. But I will note that the deliciousness or reward value of a food is not the only thing that determines whether or not it's fattening. So that's not to say that, all delicious foods are going to be fattening and there's no way to have a food that tastes good and can also be part of a slimming diet. That's not what I'm saying. But I think if you're not going to, if the food is going to be delicious, then you're going to have to leverage other things that influence body fatness instead. And you're going to have to leverage those effectively if you want that to be a slimming food.
Yeah. So here's a question, or sort of like a few statements that I was really craving to discuss with you for many months. And so this is where I also draw skepticism to the low carb and the ketogenic and the low carb, the whole community. Okay, so you have sugar on its own. A lot of people don't consume sugar as is. You have fat on its own. People don't normally just drink spoonfuls of oils. There's something going on beyond that, which causes high fat and high sugar to create this perfect storm of overconsumption. So I am still trying to understand what this is, because here's another good example. So we love to do these tiny little experiments. For example, let's take a cup of ice cream with chocolate chunks in there. That's addictive, right? But once you melt it and boil it up, and all you've done is manipulated the texture and the temperature of the product, it becomes, for some people, really gross. And then you have people, like, for example, if there's a sweet food or a certain food from another country or culture you're not conditioned to, you don't like that kind of sweet food. So these mismatches are really confusing for us. Have you ever thought of it in this direction, like what's causing these perfect storms to happen?
Yeah, absolutely. So I discuss this in my book, and I think this is actually not that hard to explain. At least most of what you said is not that hard to explain based on the science that we know. So essentially, these nutrients that I was talking about, the fat and the carbohydrate and the protein and the salt and the glutamate, those are things that the brain is hardwired to care about, basically. And so when you eat those things, receptors in your mouth and in your digestive tract, especially your small intestine, detect those nutrients and send a signal up to your brain, and that causes dopamine to be released. And dopamine is released in proportion to the concentration of those nutrients. So the more fat you have, the more carbohydrate you have, the more salt, up to a point. It doesn't, like obviously if you're eating pure salt, that's not good, but there's a kind of optimum. And the more of those things are up to that optimum that are in that food, the more dopamine you're going to get being released in parts of your brain that determine learning and motivation. And so this is essentially the same way drugs work. And I'm not saying foods are the same as drugs, but the mechanism is the same. When you smoke crack cocaine, you get a big dopamine spike. And what that does is it triggers motivation and learning circuits in your brain really, really effectively because there's lots of dopamine. And then those things cause you to like smoking crack more. They cause you to seek crack in the future. They cause you to feel motivated, to crave it, etc. That's all just how the motivational system works. But of course, that system didn't evolve to seek crack. It evolved to seek food. And so it can be stimulated by these food properties. And when you get foods that contain high concentrations of these things, especially all together in one food, like a food that combines fat and combines sugar, for example, then you get really high activation of these circuits. You get really high dopamine. You get really strong cravings, motivation, and learning happening in your brain. This is all happening non-consciously. So you're not aware that these signals are coming up. You're not aware that dopamine's spiking. But the next time you encounter that food, you're going to be like, oh, I really want that, because that process occurred previously. And so now to get a little bit into more of the details of what you said, so as you said, ice cream is not just fat and sugar. There's a flavoring in it. There's a texture to it. There's a temperature to it. It's more than that. And all of those things contribute. So it's not as good if it's warm and melted Although I'd probably drink some melted ice cream. That'd probably be pretty tasty.
Come on.
But not as tasty as ice cream, right?
Yeah.
So what is it about that specific combination? And I don't have the answer to that. I don't know why we like the coldness of it. I don't know why we like those particular flavors or that particular texture. But what I will say is that, so I'll speculate about the flavor. And I want to emphasize that this is speculation. So one of the things that the reward system does when it gets activated, when the dopamine gets activated by these nutrients in the food, is it records all the sensory experiences that you were having at that time. So it records the flavor of the ice cream and the appearance of it and the taste of it, where you were when you ate it, who you were with, what the situation was. And those things become motivational triggers in the future. So the next time you see that box of ice cream that your brain remembers, or you're with your friend at the time of night when you always eat ice cream together, or you have a little taste of it, that will trigger your motivation. That basically, to your brain, that's saying, this is a situation in which ice cream is available, and I remember that it has all these awesome nutrients. So, but we form those associations, since we form them in response to sensory cues. Taste is a very salient sensory cue. It's a very powerful sensory cue for us. And so my speculation is that the flavoring in there, whether it's, mint or chocolate or vanilla or whatever, basically gives your brain something to grab onto more easily. It gives it a strong sensory cue that it can say, okay, this is something I recognize, and I remember that when I taste this mint or when I taste this vanilla, I know that there's a lot of fat and sugar coming down the digestive tract. And so that's my speculation. I don't know. There could be other reasons, but I would put that forward as my kind of working hypothesis for why we like certain types of flavors. And
the reason why yeah, go ahead.
But okay, so I was just going to get into the last part of what you said, which was why we can like fat and sugar in the foods that we're accustomed to, but we might not like it in the context of some other culture's food that we're not accustomed to. Essentially, every culture likes fat and sugar and salt and starch. Those are things that are stamped into the human brain at a very fundamental level that all of us share from birth. But through this reinforcement learning process that I was describing, we learn to enjoy certain flavors and textures that had no meaning to us initially, that were neutral. I mean, things like for example, with let's say the taste of vanilla. If from birth I gave you a shock every time I let you taste vanilla, you probably would think that tastes horrible. You probably would hate the taste of vanilla. But instead, if every time you taste vanilla, you get fat and sugar going down your digestive tract, then vanilla tastes great. And so if you're like growing up in China and the fat and starch and sugar is coming in the form of Chinese food, all of the aromas and the textures and all that will become delicious to you by virtue of repeated association with those nutrients. But you're not necessarily going to like European food. Like a stinky French cheese will probably taste horrible to you because you haven't had that reinforcement learning process occur. And it happens most powerfully in childhood, by the way. So that's when we learn these things most easily. But you can still learn it as an adult. Like maybe someone doesn't like French cheese at first, but after they eat it a few times, they develop a taste for it. That's how we say it colloquially, that I developed a taste for this or that. And that is that reinforcement learning process happening. But if you were to eat a food like, a lot of people, for example, they end up liking greens like spinach and kale as adults, but they didn't like it as kids. That's because you had to learn that greens predicts salt and fat in your belly, because we usually put salt and fat on them. But like if you had someone always eat kale without salt and fat, just like straight up kale with nothing on it, they probably would never develop a taste for it. They'd probably think it was horrible and they would never enjoy it even as adults. But the fact that we mix it with things that the brain cares about intuitively, eventually we develop a taste for it.
Yeah. What's interesting here is that by speaking from a food company perspective, by just manipulating the texture and keeping the macronutrients the same, I have changed the amount of food you can consume. That was my point here. And I would imagine the implications of this are all over the food industry. So that was my point. And then another thing is, let's say you have different flavors of a specific food item. Let's go with ice cream again. So you have strawberry and you have vanilla. So I would imagine, hypothetically speaking, I cannot eat strawberry for an unlimited amount of period, but I can consume more strawberry with vanilla than just strawberry alone. Is that could that be just dopamine refreshing or something of that sort?
Yeah, so I don't know what the mechanism in the brain is in terms of at the neurotransmitter level. I don't know if it involves dopamine, but definitely the more variety, the more sensory variety you have in the foods that are in front of you, the more total amount you will tend to consume. So this is called sensory specific satiety, and it's one of the things I discuss in my book. So basically, if someone's, I think this is basically one of the randomized controlled trials that was done on this was used basically to design I'm about to say. They gave people different sandwiches with different things in them, different flavors. And when you had a choice of several different flavors of sandwiches, people would eat more total sandwich than if they were only offered one sandwich. And essentially what they found is that people, like if you only have one type of sandwich available, you'll eat the sandwich until you're full and then you'll be done and you're fine. You're full, you're satisfied. But that satiety that you experience, the fullness you experience in response to that one flavor doesn't necessarily fully carry over other flavors. It's kind of strange to think about, but if suddenly you have another different kind of sandwich, or even better, a slice of cake or an apple or something completely different, suddenly that thing that is very different will kind of open up your appetite again, and you'll have to eat more of that to reach the point of being satisfied. So essentially this is why we overeat at buffets. The more variety you have, if every bite is something different and you have 10 different things on your plate, you can eat a lot more total food before you feel satisfied than if you're only eating a couple of different things on your plate.
Yeah, and that was one of the concepts that I was really intrigued by, the sensory-specific satiety, and it is a wonderful concept. I think it's very underrated. Once again, your book is just an eye-opening experience. Let's move on to something that is very rampant in our low-carb community, which is the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis. So, the topics that we covered just now make me very skeptical of the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis. What's your take on it? And I think Dr. Kevin Hall recently did a study on that as well, comparing the ketogenic diet to the standard American diet, but they controlled for calories. So what's your take on that metabolic ward study, and what's going on? What's the story here?
Yeah, sure. So first thing I want to say before we dive in here, I just want to clarify a couple things, particularly given the audience that's likely to be listening to this. Basically, whether or not the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis is correct really has very little to do with whether or not low carbohydrate diets are effective for weight control. It's really a hypothesis about what the mechanism is. So we know from randomized controlled trials that most people will lose weight on a low-carb diet, and the lower you bring the carbs, the more weight loss you're going to see. We know that ketogenic diets promote weight loss probably more effectively than a moderate low-carb diet. For example, there was that recent Virta Health study So I just want to acknowledge that before I move on, that what I'm talking about is not whether or not the low carbohydrate diet is effective. I'm talking about a mechanism that some people propose to explain observed effects of low carbohydrate diets. So this is essentially the idea that, okay, so let me specify that there are different versions of the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis. There are a number of different versions, and I'm just going to focus on one that I would say is the one that most people have heard of and is probably the most popular. This is the one advocated by Gary Taubes and David Ludwig, who's a researcher at Harvard. And this is the one that says that the primary cause of obesity is carbohydrate spiking insulin, which then causes it reduces circulating energy levels in the blood, so reduces levels of glucose, reduces levels of fat, and shunts the fat into fat tissue, prevents fat tissue from releasing the fat, and ultimately makes us hungry, makes us gain fat, and makes us not want to exercise. I think that's a fair summary of their views. So I guess what I would say is that the first thing I would say is that if they were going to say that this was a factor in obesity among others, rather than saying this is the cause of obesity, which is basically what they argue, I would have a much easier time with this. I think it would be a lot more plausible. But I think saying that this is the sole cause of obesity, or at least the predominant cause of obesity, I think that's really just not even plausible, because from the get-go, because we know that there are all these other factors contributing to the development of obesity, or at least I shouldn't say we know, that implies certainty, but we have a I would say more than reasonable idea that there are a number of things that contribute to obesity, and that it's actually a complex phenomenon. And I won't go into all the reasons for that unless you want to dig deeper there. We can come back to that if you want. But yeah, there are a lot of reasons to doubt the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis as it's articulated by its most visible advocates. For example, we have very, very good evidence that fat can be fattening in the right context. And the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis basically says that fat is not fattening; it's only carbohydrate. At least, that. And I'm not putting words in people's mouths. This is actually what people like Gary Taubes have said. And yet we have excellent evidence, particularly in animal models, a wide variety of species, but especially rodents, suggesting that actually dietary fat is a pretty powerful driver of body fat gain, at least over, it's complicated because over a certain range it is. So like if you have animals on a low fat diet, they'll tend to be lean. If you have them on a very low carbohydrate, high fat diet, they'll tend to be lean. But if you have them in the middle where there's a lot of fat and carbohydrate, or where it's like 60% fat and 20% carbohydrate, they'll get very, very fat. But then if you keep upping the fat and keep dropping the carb, then it drops off and they'll get lean again. So there's basically this optimum obesity point that occurs where you have a lot of fat and a lot of carbohydrate. And so I think the better hypothesis is that both of those contribute to the development of obesity, and that if you want to be leaner, you can go to either end of the spectrum, either the very low fat or the very low carbohydrate, and either one of those will help promote fat loss and prevent fat gain. So that's pretty, I would say that's a very, I would say that is a fair assessment of the animal research literature and much of the human research literature, and I feel fairly confident in that assessment. And then there are these human randomized controlled trials, like the one that you referred to with Kevin Hall. So Kevin Hall He's done several different studies, but I think the one you're referring to was the one that was funded by the Nutrition Science Initiative, NUSI. And so they put people on a baseline kind of standard American diet, high sugar, normal carbohydrate, like typical carbohydrate intake. So like something around half of calories from carbs. I don't remember the figure exactly. And they had them in a metabolic ward. So they were controlling every morsel that crossed their lips. So they had them on a fixed number of calories, and then they switched them to a ketogenic diet that had the identical number of calories. And what they found is that, contrary to the predictions of the carbohydrate insulin model, even though, and by the way, the ketogenic diet was designed by, I think it was Jeff Volek. He's a low carbohydrate diet researcher. So this is like a real legit ketogenic diet. Insulin dropped, ketones went up, and they found that at first there was a small increase in energy expenditure, so their metabolic rate ramped up a little bit, but it declined over time, and it basically went back to baseline by the end of the diet period. And it actually initially seemed to actually impair fat loss, so they were actually losing less fat than expected, given the very small calorie deficit that they were on. And then that basically leveled out over time. So I think that probably was a temporary effect. But basically this study shows that carbohydrate restriction and reductions in insulin does not do what carbohydrate insulin hypothesis advocates think it does. That mechanism simply is not supported by that study or other studies. So, but I want to point out that, some people have seen that result and they've thought, okay, the ketogenic diet doesn't work for weight loss. But I don't think that's not really an accurate interpretation of what the result is. It was really a study on what the mechanism is, because a key aspect of the study is that the calorie intake was controlled. In real life, the calorie intake is not controlled. And so if someone goes on a ketogenic diet, typically they're going to start eating less, eating fewer calories, and they will be losing weight. And so that's more of the real life response, is when someone goes on the diet, generally their calorie intake goes down and they lose weight. So this study does not mean that ketogenic diets impair fat loss in real life. It just, all it means is that if you do go on the diet and you do lose weight, it's probably because you ate fewer calories, not because of some metabolic effect through insulin. And so basically it kind of refocuses the question on the mechanisms that are driving calorie intake, rather than this insulin mechanism and effects on metabolic rate, which are pretty much not supported. So I would like to see more research personally on why it affects calorie intake, why calorie intake goes down. And I don't know why that happens. I'm not sure anyone does. Honestly, it's possible that it could have something to do with ketones themselves acting in the brain. Maybe it could even have to do with insulin. I don't know. But we don't really know. And I think it's probably unlikely to be insulin, but I feel a lot more confident about the statement that insulin is probably not the primary driver of common obesity. I feel a lot more confident about that than I do saying that insulin is not at all involved in the weight loss that we see with low carbohydrate diets.
Yes, and that is why, right off the bat, I began this podcast talking about your book and what your tools in the inventory are. Because if the carbohydrate insulin model is not a good predictor, then we need to start looking outside of that in order to combat this obesogenic environment that we have created. And when you see, like we were just talking about, how food companies, with the simple manipulation of texture, you can change practical ways in which you can increase the caloric load of food. That is what intrigued me towards your dialogue. And I think there's something going on over there, and we need to start focusing on that direction. Correct me if I'm wrong, but fat also raises insulin long term. Is there some sense to that?
Yeah, that's a great point too. Yeah, this is not a point I usually make, but yeah, that's very valid. It can, yeah. So a couple of things. One is that after a meal, consuming fat can potentiate the insulin response that you get from consuming carbohydrate and protein. So in other words, it gives you a larger insulin spike than you would get if you had not eaten the fat along with carbohydrate or protein. So that's one thing. But over the long term, basically one of the biggest contributors, probably the biggest determinant of your insulin response, is how insulin sensitive you are. So if you are insulin resistant, you're going to be releasing tons of insulin when you eat protein and carbohydrate and fat to some extent. But if you are insulin sensitive, that same meal will produce much less insulin release, and your fasting insulin level will be much lower. So your total insulin exposure is way lower if you are lean and insulin sensitive than if you are overweight and insulin resistant. And so if the fat in your diet is contributing to the gain of body fat, then, and by that means, over the long term, it will increase your insulin exposure, and possibly by quite a lot. So, and furthermore, I'll add that there are certain researchers like James Johnson, for example, who's at UBC. He does studies in rodents, and he believes that insulin contributes to obesity, although his views are not the same on it as Gary Taubes's and David Ludwig. But in his studies, he causes elevated insulin and obesity by feeding rodents a high-fat diet. So it's, this singular focus on carbohydrate, the link between carbohydrate and insulin, I think, is really much too narrow, since protein increases insulin, fat can increase insulin, especially over the long run. And the main driver of excess insulin exposure is insulin resistance because of excess body fatness, insufficient physical activity, genetics, and all the other contributors.
And just to add a little bit over there, now we circle back to the same quote. It's delicious. So when you say that, there's a lot going on behind the scenes. So be wary, I suppose, of the kind of foods you eat. Be wary of what the science is, how it impacts the brain, how you learn about food. And so when you have these boats just falling apart, you have to go back to things like what's the impulse, what the impulse is, the learned behaviors you've acquired over time, since childhood, for example, what kind of foods you were accustomed to. So this is where, once again, I know it's sounding like I'm plugging your book again and again, but people really need to read The Hungry Brain. It is the most ketogenic, there you go, it's the most ketogenic book I can think of. So it's a very good source of knowledge. And like I said, you're onto something that is relatively groundbreaking. And I was in the same boat, just to add a disclaimer. I thought the ketogenic diet was the silver bullet. But then once, as a company, that we make food ourselves, and you start realizing how you can combine ingredients and create the most obesogenic foods, you have the power to do it. And you're also sponsoring events, and you have this influence. And you talk about that, I think, in your last chapter as well, that this has to move together. And society everyone has to make smart decisions. The consumer has to make smart decisions, and that drives the change forward. So we need to start looking into alternative ways to end this chronic condition epidemic. Do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I'll add a little something. So I think it's kind of interesting because, as you were alluding to, in industry there are these incentives, basically incentives that usually don't align very well with human health. And I think in the food industry I'm talking about. And I think it's, you're in a particular place in the food industry where your food is explicitly branded or explicitly marketed as, contributing to positive health outcomes. And so I think that gives you some flexibility there with being able to actually make healthy foods because people are actually looking for that. But for most foods, most foods don't sell because they're healthy. They sell because they're convenient. They sell because they are cheap. They sell because they're delicious. And so I think for the majority of the food industry, it's a really tough sell because changing the status quo means basically changing the things that make those foods sell so well. And so I think for it to work out on the, across the board, across our whole food environment, I think we need a system that creates a healthier food environment, but while also maintaining a level playing field for all of these companies, because if one company, like let's say, Keebler decides they don't want to use sugar anymore, or, don't want to use fat or whatever, or Nabisco or whatever, suddenly their products aren't going to sell anymore and they're going to get outcompeted. So there has to be some system in place that creates a level playing field so that all of these players together can create a better environment for all of us. That's my opinion.
And I have to agree, this is a tough battle for us as we focus on things like sensory-specific satiety. We leverage those terms that we've learned from your book, and we talk about hyperpalatability, sort of like the buffet effect of food, and we try to teach people how to use their product in a constructive way rather than a destructive way, while at the same time we're always trying to experiment with how can we play with texture and maybe certain ingredients to limit food intake. For example, chocolate, you've mentioned that it has theobromine, which is addictive, but at the same time, if you take the bitterness up to 90% or really high, then that puts a cap on how much you can consume. So these are some of the fun factors. The problem is, how do you quantify this and then put it in front of the consumer, because everybody's palate and taste is so different. And then the problem is, if you make a product that's really healthy without a brand, like just a mom and pop store, and they're like, we want to make something healthy and innovative, they can't do it because, like, we go back to the same thing. It's delicious. It tastes good. And at the same time, you're over-consuming it. Then you come up with these recipe books, which are a very similar circular loop that goes on, where foods are just way too good. And then I don't know if there's any evidence for it. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I tried. Is there any evidence for vanishing caloric density? Like, for example, if you take fruit, for example, you can only eat 3-4 or some pieces of it. But once you put it into a smoothie, you can eat a whole lot more by that method. So these are certain ways that you sort of hijack the caloric load. Is there evidence to that?
There is some evidence that liquid calories are less satiating per calorie than solid calories. But honestly, I don't know much beyond that would address your question.
Okay. Sounds good. But yeah, I was on this wonderful tirade, and you started this whole thing, so it's all your fault. So what exactly drives cravings in people?
Yeah, so essentially it's that mechanism I was talking about earlier where nutrients, when we eat a certain food, nutrients are detected by the small intestine primarily, but also receptors in the mouth. And then that goes up to the brain. That signal goes to the brain and spikes dopamine. So dopamine release in certain parts of the brain, particularly the ventral striatum / nucleus accumbens and associated parts of the forebrain. Those are the parts of the brain that generate cravings. Those are the parts of the brain that determine and generate cravings. And so, and they do so in large part via this dopamine-mediated reinforcement process. So when you eat that food, the dopamine goes up, your brain captures a snapshot of all the sensory cues that were happening when the dopamine was spiking. the taste, the texture, the appearance, where you are, what you're doing, etc. And those become motivational cues. And so when you smell that smell of brownies coming out of the oven, or when you see the box of pizza, or when you see the donut on the conference room table, or when you are in a situation where you would normally have, your dopamine starts to spike again because your brain is picking up on those sensory cues, just like Pavlov's dogs, if you're familiar with that experiment, ringing the bell. So those cues are essentially your brain is ringing the bell. They're ringing the bell for your brain. You're seeing those cues, and that's triggering the motivation, which we commonly call a craving. So essentially, craving is when your brain recognizes a cue and it's like, I want that. I see that I can have it and I want it. You can also have cravings without experiencing those sensory cues, but it's a lot less common. Cravings most often happen when a food is available and we have the cue in front of us. So, so that's basically how cravings happen.
Is short-term overconsumption a good indicator of long-term overconsumption?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's a really thorny question. There are a lot of studies on the factors that determine short-term overconsumption. Are you familiar with a guy named Brian Wansink? Have you heard of him?
Let's get familiar.
Okay, so he's a researcher at Cornell, and he wrote a book called Mindless Eating. And the book is based on huge amounts of research that he's done. And a lot of what he studies is how contextual factors determine your food intake. So if you serve yourself onto a larger plate, will you eat more food? If the popcorn is stale, will you eat less of it, et cetera, et cetera. So he studied all these things. And what his research suggests is that a lot of these contextual factors do matter, and it does affect your calorie intake in the short term. And so I remember reading his book years ago and just not really being sure what to make of it, because it's like, yeah, it has short-term effects, but none of the experiments he did measured long-term effects, and none of them measured body fatness. So I'm like, what does this really mean in the long term? I prefer to focus on mechanisms that we know are actually linked to longer-term effects in body fatness. I think those are more convincing. Well, it turns out that Brian Wansink is his lab is going belly up right now because of probably massive research misconduct, including possible fraud, although that's not clear. But a lot of the research that he did ended up probably not being so reliable, and many of his papers are being retracted. But I still, regardless of that, I still have this question of what is that relationship. And basically, I think there probably is a relationship for most things. Like if something makes you overeat more today, it probably will over the longer term. But I think we can't assume that that's the case for every single factor that we study. We can't assume that something that causes you to eat more today will always cause you to eat more. I think ideally we would want to demonstrate that it actually has a longer term effect on calorie intake and body fatness.
Sounds good. Yeah, and there was this one meta-analysis, probably you posted it or maybe I posted it. I don't know who posted it, but I'm just so lost these days. I have no idea. So there's this one meta-analysis about how binging and sugar addiction, and I can't think of it on top of my head, but it was more about how people have these intermittent binges for sugar or sweetened foods that leads to people thinking that it's an addiction. So I don't know if that rings a bell. If not, we can move to the next topic.
Yeah. So probably what you're referring to are the animal studies on sugar addiction. They have these models of so-called addiction where they give rodents intermittent access to sugar or some kind of high fat and high sugar food, and they will do this kind of binging behavior when you give them intermittent access. And in some cases, they will show withdrawal symptoms when they don't get it. So that's been used as evidence by people who believe that sugar is addictive. And so that's probably what you're referring to. I'll just comment on it briefly that it's kind of controversial whether or not that truly qualifies as addiction. And I don't know, it certainly has some features of addiction, I would say. Certainly resembles it in some ways. But I think the situation is a little bit different in humans, because a human is not going to get addicted to granulated sugar or like just plain sugar water, you know? Like, yes, you could definitely develop an unhealthy relationship with and possibly an addiction to something like a soda. That's probably the closest you could come. But most of the things that people have trouble with aren't just sugar. They're high in fat and starch and salt and other things like that. If you look at the foods that people crave the most and that people say they have an addiction-like relationship with the most, it's generally foods that are either high in fat and sugar, or foods that are high in fat and salt and sometimes starch, things like fries and chips and things. So it's, so I think it's unclear how relevant those animal models of sugar binging are to human addiction. But I would say that it certainly, if you think they are relevant, it certainly requires a little bit of interpretation, because humans don't get addicted to straight sugar.
No, they don't. In fact, we tried this experiment with mixing MCT oil with sugar. It is one of the grossest things you can try as a human being. So that's why I was looking forward to this conversation once again, is because there's a lot more that is going on in this story here. And I think there's something up in the brain that is just remembering things and just causing us to repeat that behavior and understanding what kind of food it is. So yeah, I think just my humble sort of opinion here, which can be totally destroyed, I think mice studies are usually great indicators of behavior, for example, but I don't think they're a good example of straight up sugar being addictive to human beings. That's not a good translation. So is that a good way to look at it?
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime you have results of animal studies, you have to apply some degree of skepticism about whether or not it translates to humans. And there are certain guidelines that I have about whether and how likely animal results are to be applicable to humans. I think if you're studying basic aspects of physiology, things that are highly conserved throughout evolution that have been around for a long time, those are likely to be relevant. If you're studying brain regions that are very similar in humans and rodents, like the stuff that I worked on as a postdoc, the hypothalamus, that's a really old brain region. It's been around since like hundreds of millions of years, since before we diverged with rodents, long before that. So like those, and if you look at the cell types and the nuclei and what they're doing, it's like almost identical in humans and rodents. They're shaped differently, they're different sizes, but like functionally they seem very similar. Probably not identical, but they seem very similar. And just basic things like insulin biology or that stuff is probably very similar. But I think once you start getting into the details, especially things that may have been acted upon by natural selection, like how an animal interacts within its environment, how it interacts with food, I think there you start to get into places where you might have to have a little more skepticism about how well the result translates. Another thing I'll say is that the effects of drugs on rodents often don't translate to humans. Usually, I would say, don't translate to humans. So that's another place where you have to be pretty skeptical when you're talking about the effects of specific drugs. You know, we have these studies where some drug looks so promising in rodents and then it just turns into a total bust in humans. And that happens over and over again. So there's, I think, kind of over time you can form views about, you can see what a study is about and you can say, okay, I think that's more or less likely to be relevant to humans. But I will say that, you know, there's kind of this prevalent view right now in certain parts of the diet health community that like, oh, you know, animals aren't humans, rodents are irrelevant, why would we even care about rodent studies? I think that's really a bad attitude because a lot of what we know about humans we learned from animal models, including rodents. And so if we didn't have those models, we would know a lot less about ourselves. So they actually have been really useful. But generally, the best way to do it is you do experiments in rodents in great detail, because that's one of the advantages of rodents is you can do things that you can't do in humans. So you dig really deep into the phenomenon, you figure out what's going on, and then you do simpler experiments in humans to see if you can confirm those findings in a less invasive, less complicated way. And then if you can confirm it, then you say, okay, well, this is probably right.
All right. We can talk for a huge amount of time, I can assure you. And I think we've barely scratched the surface on certain topics. But I think we should start wrapping things up. What kind of research would you like to see?
Yeah, so one of the things I mentioned before is the effect of ketogenic diets or very low carbohydrate diets on appetite. I think that would be an interesting thing to study in greater depth and also study the mechanisms by which it may have its effect. And I would also like to see studies that look at the opposite end of the spectrum, so very low fat and very high carbohydrate diets, because I think we're going to find that both ends of the spectrum have fairly similar effects and in a lot of ways. And I would like to know why that is. I think that would be really interesting. And I don't know, I guess one of the things that I think is really lacking is we know how to, we know a lot about how not to develop obesity, but the average person is not applying that knowledge. So we know that pizza is not slimming. We know that cake is not slimming. We know that brownies aren't slimming, that soda is not slimming. Yet these are things that people in the United States are eating every day. And all around the world, people who can afford it are eating things like that too. So why are people eating these things that they know are not good for them? They know are fattening. They know are unhealthy. And what can we do about it? I mean, how do you get people to just apply the knowledge we already have? I think that is an area I would like to see more research on, get better techniques for actually getting people to engage in effective diet and lifestyle changes, just even based on the knowledge we already have.
Well, outside of a full-on alien invasion where everybody gets on their toes and everything crumbles down and you're forced to hunt for food, that's going to be quite a bit of challenge, because we've conditioned these foods with positive experiences. Like, for example, look at James Bond. Guy needs to drink a cup of alcohol or take some shots before he goes to the bar or does his next mission. And so it's all over the place. Go to the cinema and all you see is associated sugary drinks with the movie. So it's going to be an interesting challenge, and I guess I have to once again circle back, as it begins with smart consumerism and we focus on foods that are good. But it's going to take some time to reverse this. So yeah. Do you have anything else you would like to quickly talk about, or can we start to wrap it up?
No, I think that's about it.
All right, Stephan, you have been an amazing guest, and I had a wonderful conversation. I'm a big fan of your work and your Twitter account. So, speaking of Twitter account, how can people find you, and what can they expect?
Yeah, so my website, my personal website is stephanguyenet.com. If that's too tough to spell, you can do wholehealthsource.org. And that'll take you to the same place. My Twitter handle is @WHSource, and I'm most active on Twitter. I post an article on my blog maybe once a month on my personal website. And then besides that, I periodically have speaking events at conferences and publishing things in the scientific literature occasionally.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Stephan. You are a blast to chat with. And everybody, go buy the darn book. It's really good. Go buy The Hungry Brain now. Thank you for listening to the show. You can visit us at ketogeek.com to check out our premium, keto-friendly, and low-carb food products, including our infamous energy pods, made from the best ingredients we could find in the entire country. We also recommend signing up for our newsletter at ketogeek.com/signup, where you get exclusive discounts, rewards, product announcements, and the latest content we are working on. You also get a 10% discount on your entire order when you sign up. Go to ketogeek.com/signup to join the low-carb playground.